Hello, my name is Reggie Chapman. I use he, him pronouns. I am the Director of Policy at the Fortune Society's David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, which is a discussion-driven show that examines the criminal legal system from various perspectives, including people most impacted by the system. Here we discuss critical questions about how the criminal legal system works, its intersections with social justice, and the efforts that advocates are making to improve the lives of everyone affected. We ask that you, the viewers, spread the word about both sides of the bars and share your comments with us on Twitter, also known as X, at the Fortune SOC. Today's show is titled Protecting People with Convictions from Housing Discrimination. The episode features two fair housing advocates, James E. Walker Jr. and Marie Claire Tran-Leung. James is the founder and executive director of the Cleveland-based Greater Possibilities. Marie is the director of the Evictions Initiative Project at the San Francisco-based National Housing Law Project. Among several advocacy efforts related to housing rights for underserved communities, they have both fought to establish local-level housing policies that prevent discrimination against people with conviction records. Today's show is centered on bringing about awareness that given the new federal administration's reversal of anti-discrimination protections, it is more important than ever that we continue to fight for local-level fair chance for housing laws that prevent discrimination against people with conviction records. And so before we get started, I just want to say good afternoon to both our guests. Good afternoon, Marie, and James. We're honored to have you here on both sides of the bars to have this discussion, and we look forward to having a healthy discussion. So with no further ado, let's begin, and let's start with our first question. So my first question is, what are some of the local fair chance for housing laws that your prospective cities have implemented that provide protections to people with criminal conviction records? And we'll start with Marie.
Thanks, Reggie, and thanks for having me here today. I'm really excited to be with everyone. So I live in Los Angeles, and I know there are currently some efforts both at the city and county level to create fair chance housing ordinances, and that is coalitions have formed around that and have been making great progress towards that. But in the past, though, one of the areas where I have really worked on is in Cook County, Illinois, which is where the city of Chicago sits. And for a number of years, we worked with a coalition called the Just Housing Initiative that fought to create protections for people with records, and specifically amended the Cook County Human Rights Act to add those protections. And a couple of the main protections there is, number one, under the Just Housing Amendment, landlords cannot consider juvenile records and arrest records that didn't lead to a conviction. So those records are off the table. And then for everything else, the law prohibits landlords from creating blanket bans for anyone who has a record, and instead requires landlords in the vast majority of cases to do an individualized assessment so that they look beyond the four corners of a person's criminal background check and assesses their readiness and ability to fulfill the responsibilities of tenancy. And so that was passed in 2019. I think we're coming up on the 6-year anniversary of that law being implemented, and I think has been really successful in Cook County.
Yes, it actually sounds like it. In the law that which you guys got passed in Chicago, Cook County, sounds very, very similar to the New York City's Fair Chance for Housing Act, which we got passed in 2000, which went into effect in January 1st, 2025. It has some of the same parameters, and it also amended the Human Rights Act. And so it provides some of the same protections in which you provide. So it's good to see that other cities are doing not only some of the same works, but that some of the local laws actually reflect some of the work that we do in New York City, which is important because, as we know, New York City has some of the most robust fair chance for housing laws, or human rights laws, should I say. And so, yeah, that sounds very, very promising, that what you have going on in Cook County. And so I'll pose the question again to Mr. Walker. James, can you provide us with some of the local fair chance for housing laws that are being implemented in your city?
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for the invitation, Reggie. And hi, Claire. Great to see you again. You spoke to us here in Cleveland a while ago as we were beginning our effort to get to where you guys got to in Cook County for a fair chance housing ordinance. The direct answer to your question, Reggie, is that currently here in Cleveland, which is in Cuyahoga County, we have no uh, specific protections, fair housing, fair chance housing protections for justice impacted people. And our local reentry community is currently at work to change that. So that's the answer to the question. We're trying to get to where Claire was able to go in Cook County. We're trying to get to where New York City has gone. And we are encouraged and inspired by both of those examples.
Great, Mr. Walker. I just want to say that, like, I understand what you're saying about Cleveland not having the resources to, like, get things done at the same rate in which New York or Chicago are doing. But I commend you on your work, and it makes me think about, had you guys had the resources and some of the support that a city like New York or Chicago may have, you would have actually gotten these laws passed. So I commend you on that work, and it kind of makes me think about this idea of why we're having this conversation, because like cities throughout America, we need to band together. We need to talk to each other. We need to work together so that we can share some information, so that we can support each other and strategize and help a city like Cleveland establish some of the same laws that a city like Chicago or New York has. Just want to say that to you, Mr. Walker. And so with that being said, that's actually a good transition to my next question. And so my next question is that, which actually is kind of fixated on the actual, the real aim of this conversation, is that considering what the new federal administration has been doing with respects to civil rights protections, how important is it that for local governments to actually pass these fair chance for housing laws? And with that, I'll pass it to Marie.
Sure. Well, that's a great question. And I guess right now we find ourselves sort of in the midst of probably a lot of chaos with the federal government. And so I work at the National Housing Law Project. We work a lot with the federal agency, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is HUD, who both has federal housing programs and then enforces the Fair Housing Act. And so right now, what we're seeing at the federal government is just a lot of change. There's been a lot of cuts to staffing. So the people who would enforce the laws or be able to administer the housing programs. We've also seen a lot of funding cuts, both to the agency and also to organizations and nonprofits that would also help with enforcing laws. So, for example, like fair housing organizations in the last week have seen, or in the last month, have seen a lot of terminations as well. And then that's sort of the resources that HUD has, and then the policy of whether this administration will be in support of fair chance housing is a little bit up in the air. We don't know one way or the other whether the Trump administration is going to prioritize this. So while we kind of figure out what's going to happen with the Trump administration, it's really important, I think, to keep the momentum going at the local level, because local fair chance protections can really, number one, help people who are really help provide tangible protections for people who have records, who are trying to access housing and stay in housing. It also brings together coalitions, like broad coalitions that are in support of these type of laws. So Cleveland may not have, and Cuyahoga County might not have the laws yet, but I know from working with a lot of the coalition members, that is a really strong coalition, that there are a lot of different types of players that are in there, stakeholders who are trying to get really strong laws passed. And those type of coalitions at the local level are really important for future base building and future changes. And then the last reason why I think it's really important to have the local protections is that the local protections is what sets the foundation for federal protections later. So, you know, what happens at the local level, what happens in a place like Cook County and New York, and how the laws are implemented, those become lessons that then we can advocate for at the federal level when the time comes. So, so I think just in terms of the kind of uncertainty of what's going to happen at the federal level with fair chance housing, and also the potential for stronger protections in the future, make it really, really important for advocates to push for these changes at the local government level.
Thank you for that information. You said a lot in that. I actually want to unpack two things in particular. Was this idea of like what's happening at the federal level, the lack of protections that this new administration has, well, the protections that this new administration has taken from us. I also want to ask you about like how does the removal of these protections like prevent activists or advocates of actually doing the work itself? Can you expound on that a little bit?
So I think the removal of the resources at the federal level, I think can sometimes just make it harder to enforce even the act of enforcing fair housing laws can feel more difficult right now. So I will say, I should back up and say, part of what we have seen from HUD and from others is that people with records often have fair housing rights as well, and that it's not okay for a landlord to just deny somebody housing purely based on a record and nothing else, and not consider, and just looking at sort of the four corners of a person's background check, and that is grounded in fair housing law. So you really need what we're kind of looking for through these ordinances, what we're looking for from HUD is somebody is to enforce those fair housing laws. And so what the but what has happened in the first few weeks and months of the Trump administration is a dismantling of the infrastructure at the federal level to enforce fair housing laws. So I know, for example, in Cleveland, like one of the main fair housing groups has their grants have been totally terminated, which impacts their ability to sort of to help people with records enforce their fair housing rights. And so the federal government, I think, is not necessarily primed to save us. And so being able to like look to our community and think about, what do we prioritize? What does safety mean to us? What does housing justice mean to us? Is something that we really need to look within our communities for, and then also look to other communities who have advanced these rights, and be able to sort of pool our resources to make our communities stronger, especially for people who are coming home from the criminal legal system.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for that, Marie. Thank you for that response. You kind of answered the question I was going to ask you, and just talking about, because it connected to something else you said in your first response, which is that like using legislation and or ideas at the local level, you can kind of expand out and build from that, as opposed to trying to look to the federal government to come down. I actually like that, and it kind of speaks to something we're doing in New York City. But before I go on to that, I'll pass it to James and see if he can give us some insight on that same question. James?
Yeah, I appreciate Marie's response to the question. I would just tell you that from where I sit, we are seeing the rollbacks, the pullbacks at the federal level, not just specifically for HUD, but for even homelessness services and funding. The question of fair chance housing, housing access, all of that is intertwined with homelessness. So as funds become less available to our local continuum of care, for instance, I expect that we're going to see a rise in the number of homeless folks here in Cleveland and Cuyahoga County. That's not good for anybody. Our system is already strained. In addition, Marie referenced one of our larger federal contractors here when it comes to the disbursement of federal housing funds being part of a newly filed class action suit in response to this freezing of funding. So both at the county level and at the city level here, I can tell you that everybody's in a tizzy about not being able to, for instance, pay landlords who have been so gracious as to accept housing vouchers, right? There was just an article in the local paper yesterday, or even as we speak, about the delay in the delivery of funds that have already been allocated and awarded since the launch of the new administration. In addition to that, again, we see and we fully expect that HUD's funding will be tremendously slashed. They're talking about closing down field offices, slashing their staffing across the board. All of this will magnify the issues of homelessness and housing instability. And so anything that does that definitely speaks to the importance of local protections for the population that I represent, which is justice impacted people, but also for the larger population of housing challenged folks. Cleveland is not a rich city. Cleveland proper is actually a poor city. And so there are a tremendous number of people here in our local community who would tend to suffer in real and material ways if we don't get this funding issue straightened out at the national level as soon as possible.
Thank you, James. I appreciate you bringing up this idea of like how funding streams would exacerbate this issue, and so it makes me think about what we're doing here in New York City. As a director of policy at the Fortune Society's David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy, we also recognize that because we are co-chairs or co-leaders of the Fair Chance for Housing Coalition, and what we've done recently because of this threat of a lack of federal funding. Just recently, I actually testified in New York City Council requesting that they provide the agency that enforces the Fair Chance for Housing Act in our city, which is New York City Commission on Human Rights. I've been out here advocating and requesting that entity receives more funding for the actual agency that enforces the law. And so it makes me, when you mentioned that, it makes me thinking about like we have to come up with like alternative funding sources. In this instance, maybe it's private donors, and most likely our state and local governments. You mentioned that Cleveland is not a very, very rich city, and I understand that. And that's probably one of the more problematic things about your condition in Cleveland. But what I think about is that really getting a grassroots organizations going. Marie mentioned getting coalitions together. So getting these coalitions together so that they can do some of the things we're doing in New York, which is like getting together, advocating, protesting, and mandating that our local legislators pass laws to not only establish these fair chance for housing laws and acts in respect to justice impacted people, but also importantly, to make sure funds are adequately allocated to the organizations that need to, to fund them and enforce them. So it makes me think about that, and I appreciate that. And it kind of makes me harken back to what Marie was saying, and when she talked about coalitions coming together. Marie, I want to know, what's your opinion about that, like the impact that coalitions can have in respect to generating funds for the establishment and or the implementation of fair chance for housing laws at the local level?
Coalitions are hugely important. I think it brings together all sorts of stakeholders that maybe policymakers don't totally understand or invested in this fight. So in Cook County, when we worked on the Just Housing Amendment, we made sure that our coalition was led by folks who are directly impacted. And also we made sure to diversify the outreach as much as possible. We had some housing providers that saw the benefit of second chance and fair chance. We had hospitals, like local hospitals, that saw the impact on families of homelessness, and I'm so glad that that we also mentioned homelessness too, because that's a huge part of this problem. We brought in the teachers unions who could testify about the impact that the lack of these protections had on children, especially if their parent had a record and was having trouble to find housing. We brought in domestic violence shelters, a lot of different parts of the community that could show the policymakers that this is not a niche issue, but one that really ripples across the community. And so that's really important for getting the policy passed, but it's also equally important for making sure that the policy is implemented and that there is enough funding to make sure that the spirit of the law as it was passed actually comes to fruition. And so being able to keep those coalitions together and for policymakers to hear from all parts of the community about why this issue is important and why we need to stay on top of it is necessary, I think, to sustain the wins in the long run.
Thank you for that response. And so that again allows me to segue into our third question, and I'll present this with James first. And so James, you mentioned earlier that Cleveland doesn't have the policies in place specifically for justice impacted people, but you guys need to get it done. And I also know that you're head of an organization. So just thinking about that, I want to kind of tie that into my next question: is that do the agencies that may be potentially responsible for implementing any fair chance for housing law as it pertains to justice impacted people, do you think they're funded correctly? And if they're not, what are some of the things that you would think about doing going forward in Cleveland to get some of that done? Mr. Walker.
Yeah, appreciate the question. So I have worked in homeless services here for over a decade. So I'm pretty familiar with our local landscape. And just to revisit the whole issue of coalitions, right? Our local continuum of care is a diverse group of community-based social service support agencies. Many of them are involved in our local coalition work to advance housing access for justice impacted people. But I think we need to acknowledge at this particular moment that with the funding issues in Washington, virtually all of our coalition partners are also impacted in terms of their resources, which also complicates, right, the building of the coalition and the effectiveness of the coalition. Coalitions are absolutely necessary. You know, none of the ordinances that have been achieved were achieved without coalition. And likewise, we will not achieve an ordinance in Cuyahoga County without coalition. Ultimately, we'll get there, but everyone is compromised at this moment. And I don't know that I answered your specific question, Reggie. If I didn't, repeat it to me right quick, and I'll finish it off.
No, actually, James, that was an amazing response, and it just it caused me to think about so many things in respect to this issue, and it's gonna actually, even when we leave this show, really like motivate me to go back and think about some of these questions, because it's an urgent issue, and we really don't have all the issues in this moment. But again, you've given me something to think about. I think that this entire conversation has been very stimulating to all of us, and hopefully our viewers. No, James, you answered the question correctly. Again, I'm going to do more research on it, because this is a major issue when you think of a city like Cleveland. So I just want to say that to you. But again, just to speak to the overarching issue which you highlighted, this is a serious issue. We have a lot of work to do. And places like Cleveland that are not as fortunate as New York, we need to help cities like yours, and see if we can provide some guidance and empower the base and think about alternative ways to get funding for nonprofits and community-based organizations to get the work done. However, as stimulating as this conversation was, we're kind of up against time, and so unfortunately, we're going to be closing out pretty soon. But before we do that, before we end the show, I have a few concluding remarks. I just want to thank my guests, Marie and James, for sharing their wisdom and experience. I also want to thank the viewers for joining us for a thought-provoking discussion. And on behalf of the Fortune Society, we thank you so much for tuning in to Both Sides of the Bars. If you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, please check us out on the web at thefortunesociety.org. That is thefortunesociety.org. or on Facebook by typing the Fortune Society. This is Reggie Chapman. I appreciate you all for joining in as we critically look at both sides of the bars, and I look forward to seeing you again on some of our future shows. Thank you.